The emerging Muslim community under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad was surrounded by two of the greatest civilizations known in the history of mankind, the Roman Byzantines and the Persians. Despite histories of achievement in the service of humanity, civilian populations were ravaged by war and suffered mass genocide at their hands.
Innocent civilians were raped and killed. Cities were looted, plundered, and put ablaze in wars at that time at the hands of the Romans and the Persians, like in Salamis, Carthage, Rhodes, and Sardis, and in many other places.
Islam did not allow combat except after putting regulations on it. There is a code of combat in Islam.
He strongly emphasized the protection of civilians and their property, as well as aiding them through the difficult times after conflict.
When we talk about the Prophet's teaching in its relationship to jihad, there are two important points that we need to make. One, we've already made: when it is allowable for a Muslim to fight, and that was clarified earlier. But secondly, this is not like some type of WWF anarchist approach towards fighting. The Prophet, peace be upon him, as well as the Quran, laid out very specific examples and rules for the one who's engaged in combat. Because combat is one of the most hated words in Islam. In fact, people would come to the Prophet and say that they named their son war, and the Prophet would say, change your son's name. Combat is not something that's liked by people. So definitely has to come with rules, because the ability for people to oppress and harm others is great in combat. So number one, the Prophet forbade us very clearly not to kill people from other faiths, religious leaders of other faiths. Number one, to harm the older, elderly people, to harm those people who are unarmed, to harm children, to harm any innocent civilian is clearly forbidden in Islam. In fact, some of the prophetic narrations about killing the innocent and warning against doing so have reached the status of what's called tawatur, which means so many people narrated those statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that there's no room for doubt, there's no room for questioning them, and the Muslim is bound to act on them, or he goes outside of what's called war and becomes what's known as a terrorist.
The controversy over what to count as legitimate act of war or a good act of jihad versus what must be considered a vicious act of terrorism has created an atmosphere of confusion which some have used to their advantage.
There seemed to be a great mix-up between martyrdom in a sense of self-sacrifice, something which is regarded as a noble act by all armies all over the world, people who sacrifice their life and are praised as heroes or freedom fighters on one hand, even if that requires self-sacrifice, and between acts of terror with people who are misled to believe that this is martyrdom. In other words, there are acts that are Islamically acceptable as true martyrdom that are called terrorist activities. And there are also acts that are basically terroristic acts and violate the teachings of Islam, that some people call it jihad or martyrdom. That confusion must be removed.
The rules of international law on methods and means of warfare, it's known as international humanitarian law. It places very strict limits. You distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Combatants are a legitimate target, non-combatants are not a legitimate target. And those rules are now codified in a set of instruments that were negotiated and concluded in 1949, the Geneva Conventions. And there are 4 Geneva Conventions supplemented by 2 protocols in 1977. And the rules in Geneva, to a very large extent, reflect what's called customary international law. That's to say they are binding on everyone, on all states, on all actors, on non-governmental entities as well.
Among the teachings of Islam is that no one can be fought except a combatant. And this is one of the main rulings of the Code of Combat in Islam, which is stated clearly in various verses of the Quran and the statements made by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
The Quran says, "And fight in the cause of God those who fight against you, but begin not hostilities. Indeed, God does not love those who commit aggression."
By saying fight those who fight you, the verse is clearly putting a limitation on fighting to be directed only against combatants who took arms against Muslims and started hostilities.
Violating the Islamic ethical code of combat, such as targeting non-combatants or fighting an unjust war, disqualifies it as jihad.
Killing civilians on 9/11 cannot be justified in Islam. What happened on 7/7 cannot be justified in Islam. Bombing civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki can also not be justified in Islam.
Innocent civilians are innocent civilians. We don't have something called collateral damage in Islam. Collateral damage could show up on the day of judgment and speak against you. A child, an innocent woman, an innocent man, or an old person. So we have to really clarify this point for people and have to actively address Muslims who carry those ideas too, that the killing of innocents, the killing of innocent civilians is an issue of violating a treaty, which is a form of hypocrisy and lying, which are from some of the major sins in Islam. So by killing an innocent person, not only are you bringing upon yourself the major sin of murder, you're bringing on yourself the major sin of hypocrisy as well as forgery and lying.
Even though the Islamic rulings are clear as to the prohibition of targeting non-combatants, some Muslim fanatics who fail to comprehend the rulings of jihad have been involved in terrorism. Less than 2 decades after the death of Prophet Muhammad, fanaticism appeared amongst a group of Muslims known as the Khawarij, or Kharijites.
Shortly after the death of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a group called the Khawarij surfaced, and their primary function was destruction, killing, and chaos, disregarding the Quranic injunction that ordered people to respect the sanctity of the soul.
Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, foretold the appearance of fanaticism amongst some Muslims. He spoke about their characteristics.
Prophet Muhammad explained that the problem was not that their intentions were corrupt, but rather it was their understanding of the religion that was not sound. He said, "Each of you would consider his own prayers and fasting insignificant compared to their prayers and fasting. They would recite the Quran, but it would not go any deeper than their throats. They would leave the religion just as the arrow exits from the other side of the prey."
Sins in Islam are of 2 types, major sins and minor sins. Killing is among the major sins. It's a major sin to kill in Islam to the extent that killing one innocent soul is equal to the killing of all mankind.
The Quran says, "Whoever kills a person, except in punishment for the killing of another person, or for the spreading of dire corruption in the earth, it shall be reckoned as though he has killed all humankind. And whoever saves a life, it shall be reckoned as though he has saved the life of all humankind." Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, alluded to the greatness of the crime of murder when he said, "A faithful believer remains at liberty regarding his religion unless he kills somebody unlawfully."
Because of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings that murder is a major sin and a vicious and evil crime, violent ideologies like that of al-Khawarij never found a good medium to propagate in the Muslim world, except in the past few decades. This is a phenomenon worthy of studying.
The ideology of the Khawarij reemerged during the past few decades. Similarly, the contemporary extremists incorrectly interpret Quranic texts to justifying the killing of civilians.
The birth of the Khawarij really provides an archetype for Muslims to constantly compare those groups who claim or take a stake in authenticity. And when we look at the Khawarij, we see a few common traits. Number one is hyperliteralism. There is no concept of analogy, no concern for context of text. The verse is what it is. The meanings of the words are as they are, and there's no deep investigation into the reasons and objectives behind religious text. Number two is a fetish for standing up against religious scholarship, discrediting the role of scholars, the guidance of scholars. Number three is looking at society in general, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, in a very, very negative way, in apocalyptic fashion. And interesting enough, many of these traits are shared amongst groups like Qaeda, as well as some of the more fringe neoconservative groups in North America, who, for example, have called for the death of our President Obama. Some of them are supplicating in churches, asking for his demise. These type of traits, Muslims look at them and are reminded of that devastating historical epic that we encountered when we dealt with the Khawarij.
Fadl Soliman, a Muslim who has dedicated his life to educating non-Muslims on Islam and to de-radicalizing Muslim youth who may have fallen under the influence of self-appointed leaders, challenged their ideology.
We have our own law, the law of God, who says in his book, وَإِنْ آقَبْتُمْ فَآقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا أُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ. And if you punish, let your punishment be proportionate to the wrong that has been done to you.
In fact, they debated with me, saying, according to this verse in the Quran, we are allowed to kill their innocents and their civilians, as they killed our innocents and our civilians in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Kashmir. So I said, but they did not only kill our civilians, they also raped our women in Bosnia. If you think that the verse is actually allowing you to respond to them in the same way you were harmed, why don't you go and rape their women? They said, no, we don't do that. I said, why not? Don't you think that the verse is allowing you to do this? They said, no, rape is an illegal sexual act. I said, therefore, the verse is not general. This verse is equal to the one in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which also exists in the Quran, which means that simply if someone blew up one eye for you, you cannot blow up both his eyes. If someone damaged one tooth for you, you cannot go and damage all his 32 teeth. One eye and one tooth do not transgress your limits. But still, you cannot rape women, even if your enemy did. You cannot kill non-combatant civilians, even if your enemy did, or you would be exactly like them.
The Old Testament says, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. The Quran says, now, in it we prescribe for them a life for a life, and an eye for an eye, and a nose for a nose, and an ear for an ear, and a tooth for a tooth, and retribution for wounds. Yet whoever would forego this, out of charity, then it will be taken as an atonement for the one who has suffered injury.